Today's episode is hot off the training presses. What I mean by that is I was just doing a global training for a company on virtual presence and how to make your virtual presentations as effective as possible. And you know that this is a topic that I tackle a lot, whether it be in training or in coaching or in webinars. So I was doing this training and I had a question come up. They said, hey, what do I do if I am the only person who has my camera on during a virtual call? And I thought, wow, okay, this is a great question and one that might be an excellent topic for my speaker tip spotlight series. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What do you do if you're the only person with your camera on and everybody else in gallery view is a disembodied voice? Stay tuned. I'll give you 3 ways that you can determine whether a camera on is the best course of action or if you can afford to keep it off. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a 4-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. If you've been following this podcast for a while, I would imagine that you probably are aware that I've written 4 books. And the first one was On-Camera Coach, which talks about my on-camera methodology that I've been using for 15 years, well before Zoom was a household name. The next 3 were written with Dr. Joe Allen, who is one of the foremost meeting scientists in the world. He's the director of the Center for Meeting Effectiveness at the University of Utah. And the 3 books that I wrote with Joe focus on meetings where video is at their core. Suddenly virtual meetings, suddenly hybrid meetings. And then based on the success of those 2, we were asked to write a book for the Dummies series called Running Effective Meetings for Dummies. So each of those books that we wrote together focused on how to use the camera effectively. And in each of them, I talked about when it was imperative to have your camera on and when it was not as much of an issue. And there are 3 things that I typically like to consider when it comes to making that determination. One of the things that I wanted to add before we get into those 3 questions is if you want to own the room, if you want to have presence in the room, you need to be seen in the room. So if you think it's okay for you to just show up in your circle with your initials and that somehow you're going to come across as an authority, perhaps you might, but boy, it's a whole lot easier to be able to establish yourself in the room whenever they can put a face with a name or in some cases initials. So if you are wanting to have as much presence in the room as possible, you want to be using both audio and video. But with that in mind, here are some things that I would also suggest that you think about when it comes to determining whether to have camera on or camera off. So the first one is, what's the size of the meeting? So if you are going into a meeting that has a ton of people in it, you are not the person who is presenting the information. You are rather receiving the information and there's really no expectation of interaction. It is perfectly okay to have your camera off. In fact, the training that I just came from, it was very large and we asked people to have their cameras off because we needed to preserve bandwidth. So there are some good reasons for having the camera off. If you are just receiving the information and it's more like a webinar, totally fine to have your camera off. It actually might be a better thing because you can have a meeting right? With just audio alone. You cannot have a meeting with just video alone. So if you have some bandwidth issues, if it's going to be compromised by having everybody with their cameras on, turn your cameras off and just be able to have the conversation with audio alone. So if you are in a big meeting, no expectation of interaction, feel free to keep your camera off. The second thing I like to think about is, what is your relationship to the people in the meeting? So if you are meeting with a group of people you've known for a long time, say like your team that you've been a part of for years, and you know that Joe has a great sense of humor and he tends to be a little sarcastic. And when he's sarcastic, oftentimes he'll roll his eyes. You do not need to see Joe roll his eyes because you know he's rolling his eyes when he says something sarcastic. You can visualize it in your brain because you've seen it a bunch of times. If you are meeting with people on a regular basis, say it's like your daily stand-up or your scrum, or your weekly stand-up or your scrum, you do not need to have your cameras on. Sometimes it's nice though. Sometimes it's nice to be able to just connect with people and have that, name with a face, obviously. But it's not mandatory because you have this bank of nonverbals that you have amassed over the years of working with these folks. But let's say that you have a new person to the team. And they're coming in and they have not had the opportunity to build that bank of nonverbals and haven't had an opportunity to see people as full people and not just as their disembodied voices. You want to be able to give them a chance to do that. So what I would suggest is at least for the first, couple of months, make it a camera on situation so that people who are new to the team can start to feel more integrated and a part of the team and have that cohesiveness that everybody else has developed over time. So the third thing I would think about is the topic that is being discussed. If the topic is emotionally hefty or if it's very complex, you want to be able to communicate over the richest medium possible. So the richest medium possible is face to face, right? That makes sense. It's, fully encompassing of all the senses. But barring that, a close second is video and audio. So the distant third is audio alone. There's a huge drop off. And this is indicated by the meeting science that Dr. Allen delves in on a daily basis. So if you are talking about something that is hard to understand or might have a lot of emotional heft, then you want to use the richest medium possible. If you can't meet face to face, then turn your camera on. And that way you can, read the body language of the people who are receiving the message. And they can also, read your body language because up to 55% of how we communicate is through our nonverbals. And if you have your camera off, your body language is silent, and it makes it really difficult for people to be able to understand the intent of your message in full. And if they have their cameras off, you know how difficult it is for you to understand the impact of your message on them. So it is very valuable to have the camera on in that circumstance. So for the person who is asking, what do I do when I go into a meeting and I'm the only person with my camera on? Well, that's a tricky situation. It for sure is, because you don't want to feel like you are in the spotlight alone. But I think it also depends upon what your role is in that meeting. If you are leading the meeting, if you are presenting in that meeting, having your camera on allows you to be able to kind of command that space. And when you have your camera on, it makes you more memorable. And it also makes your message more memorable. Now, if you are somebody who is a spectator, probably having your camera off might not be such a bad idea, but think about what you are hoping to accomplish in that meeting itself. Go over those 3 questions. What is the size of the meeting? What is your relationship with the people in the meeting? And what is the topic that we're discussing? Does it demand a higher level of media richness? I am eternally fascinated by new research that comes out related to camera on versus camera off. And one of the more recent articles that I was taking a look at is in the European Journal of Social Psychology. And it was trying to decide whether camera usage was good or bad during virtual meetings. And I'm going to speak at a very high level, but what it found is that if you had your camera off in virtual interactions, it can harm your reputation. So there's a lot of nuance around that, but the basic gist of it was that those who had their camera off came across as less leader-like, that is their word, and less engaged. And so they said it could potentially undermine your career progression and even damage your reputation. So I thought this was really interesting, and I always like to validate my opinions with some data. So in this week's bonus content, I'm going to give you a link to that article so you can check it out for yourself and use it as a potential guide for how you decide whether you want to have your video on or keep your video off. So thank you so much for listening to this week's Speaker Tips Spotlight. Until next time, everybody.